Good evening and welcome to this evening's Global Voices program. Tonight's program is part of our World Beyond the Headlines lecture series. This popular public lecture series is a collaborative project of the Center for International Studies at the University of Chicago, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, with support from the McCormick Tribune Foundation. The program aims to bring scholars and journalists together to consider major international news stories and how these stories are covered. We are pleased tonight to have Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Elliot Jaspin join us to speak about his new book, Buried in Bitter Waters. And before we begin, I'd like to just remind you of two upcoming programs in this series. Next Friday, April 27th at 5 p.m., we will welcome Kathleen Kennedy Townsend speaking on her new book, Failing America's Faithful, How Today's Churches Are Mixing God with Politics and Losing Their Way. And then on Tuesday, May 15th at 6 p.m., we will welcome William Languish speaking on The Atomic Bazaar, The Rise of the Nuclear Poor. And as always, for those of you that can't make it to a program, streaming and downloadable audio and video are now available on the University of Chicago's International and Area Studies Multimedia and Outreach Source at the Center for International Studies website, so you can check that out. And now we'd like to welcome Elliot Jaspin. Thank you.
Okay. Before I get started, it's probably a bad way to start off, but I found out this afternoon New York Times is naming this book an editor's choice in a couple of weeks. Yes. So, back in 1998, I was working on a story on food safety, and so I was in a little town in Arkansas called Berryville. They have a Tyson's chicken plant there, and I'd been there about a day and a half, and I was between interviews. I had some time to kill, and there was this little local history museum in the town square, so I thought I'd go in there and take a look around. And it was a really eccentric place. There was one room that had all antique embalming equipment. It's probably the best exhibition of antique embalming equipment I've ever seen. Anyhow, I'm wandering around, and on the wall is this photograph of sort of a ma and pa kettle from about the 1850s. And so I wandered over, took a look at that, and then below the photograph was this guy's will. So I'm sitting there, and I leave my suspenders to Uncle Fred and that sort of thing. And a few lines down it says, "And to my beloved wife Bessie, I leave my 5 slaves." It's interesting. My first reaction, and I think it's reaction of almost anybody when they just stumble across the artifacts of slavery, is one of shock and horror. I remember being down in the Caribbean, and we pulled into this port, and there was this cage in the middle of the town square. And so I asked somebody, what's that about? And he says, well, that's the slave cage. That's where they kept the slaves that were being sent to market, to be sold off. But my second reaction when I read that line was sort of a consternation, because, again, I'd been there about a day and a half, and I hadn't seen a single black person. And this will told me blacks had lived in this town. So for the next few days, as I'm going around to the different interviews and seeing things, I made a conscious effort to see if I could find any blacks in the area. And if you've never been there, this is sort of like Branson, Missouri. It has a lot of these country and western parlors and whatnot. So there's a lot of there's a lot of restaurants, there's a lot of entertainment, and there's a lot of people coming through. And I even got down to looking into cars as they went by to see, maybe there's a black in the car. Nothing. Not a one. Last day, last interview, last question, I asked this woman, I was just curious. I said, I've been here now for 5 or 6 days. I haven't seen a single black face. How come? She says, oh, Klan keeps them out. Oh, got it. My specialty is something called computer-assisted reporting. What I do is I take government databases and analyze them for news stories. So after I got back to Washington, I was curious, and I went to the 1990 census data, and it was in a database, and so I asked the question, show me all white or virtually all white counties in Arkansas. And I didn't think there would be many. And about a third of the counties came up. And I was like, this is not right. So then I expanded the search and I said, well, show me all white counties in the South. And more counties started coming up. And then I expanded the search and I went, the border states, the North, more and more counties kept appearing. I was like puzzled. This made no sense to me. As luck would have it, as I was doing this, it took several days. One of the Cox newspapers, one of their papers is the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. So somebody was up from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in the Washington Bureau, and we were chatting, and I said, this is the damnedest thing, and I explained what had happened. She says, well, Forsyth County, which is just up the road from Atlanta, they ran all the blacks out of there. And I was like, excuse me? I never heard this. So then I started to wonder, is what I'm looking at the legacy of blacks being driven out of a county? It seemed far-fetched, but it was, a theory. So I wrote a small computer program. I got historical census data, and the computer program, very, very simple. What it did was it sorted by each county and by year, and I did from 1890 to 1930. Later on, I went back to 1880, and I said, show me counties where there was a drop of 50% or greater in the black population between 2 census periods. And I ran the program, and I figured 2, 3, maybe 4 tops would come popping out. Hundreds came rolling out. And then I was like, this is really making no sense. So I printed out these counties, and the next thing I did was I went up to the Library of Congress to see if maybe I could find something in old newspaper records which would explain. What I'd done at this point was I had narrowed it down to a 10-year time frame. Something happened in that 10-year period and that caused the black population to leave. And to make a very long story short, I went on the microfilm reader. I went back to some of these counties, and there I saw the story of how whites would riot and drive all the blacks out of a county. And what I looked at, I saw Forsyth County, Georgia, Marshall County, Kentucky, Unicoi County, Tennessee, and Comanche County, Texas. The list went on and on and on. Eventually, what I had to do, because I had so many counties And I was only looking at the county level. I was not looking at the town level. And probably some people in this room, maybe all of you in this room, are familiar with Rosewood, Florida, where the black community there was burned out, or Tulsa. But those were towns. I was talking a much larger geographic area, counties. And when I had so many counties that eventually I had to come up with some way to limit this so that I could get my arms around it, so I could begin to investigate it. Because if I started with 200, just to name a number, I'd still be at it today. So what I came up with was a set of standards that are the basis for this book. The standards are these. First of all, it had to be county-wide. Secondly, it had to be relatively sudden. This isn't where, whites really hated blacks and blacks got fed up after 20 years and decided we're going to move on. There had to have been an ultimatum issued from the white community to the black community saying, you will leave or we will kill you. And I had to have a contemporary account, something which said, this is what happened. And finally, and in my mind, most importantly, it had to have been a successful racial cleansing. What do I mean by successful? The county had to be white or virtually all white today. Now, what do I mean by virtually all white? It's sort of a slippery term. The standard I set up was this. The black population in these counties where there had been a racial cleansing can be no larger than what it was prior to the racial cleansing when it occurred back in, let's say, 1900. So, for example, Forsyth County, Georgia, there were approximately 1,000 blacks living in Forsyth County. The county, total population of the county was 12,000. In 1990, I may be slightly off by 4 or 5, but not much more. There were 27. In 2000, there were 684. So the number of blacks living there in 2000 was still below the 1,000 at the time of the racial cleansing. So that makes it, in my mind, white or virtually all white today. And even when I constricted it to that group, that small group, I still had to stop researching because I had too many counties. I hit a dozen, and I figured, well, that's going to be it. So that was the basis of the book, and the book is a recounting of these dozen successful racial cleansings. The point of the book, or one of the points of the book, is that this occurred. I set the standards so high, the bar so high, that I felt that no one could come back and say, this did not occur. Because the other thing I have learned through this project is the level of denial in America on race is incredible. And it has, and I have to say, I'm living proof of that. When I did this research, what I had no idea was that the trail would lead back to my own company, Cox Newspapers. And I wrote about the role that Cox Newspapers, and specifically the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, had in talking about Forsyth County, Georgia in particular. As a result of my doing that in the newspaper series that I prepared, I also wrote about it. It's the last chapter of the book. I've been demoted from an editor to reporter. I'm a pariah within the company, and the company and the newspapers that comprise Cox Newspapers are now boycotting my articles, so that sit in Washington, I write a newspaper story, and it appears nowhere. And so, that's the way things work. Going from something that grim, a few weeks ago, a friend of mine got me this book, Publicize Your Book, How to Do It. And so I'm reading through it, and there's a section on, and I should have found this before I got up here. There it is. There's a section on speaking engagements, this. And so I was reading this, and it said, if your book is nonfiction, then create a short talk based on the key themes of your work. A straight reading of nonfiction almost never works. And I went, son of a bitch, I'll do a reading. So, this will give you a sense of what a racial cleansing looks like, or is like. This one occurred in a place called Pierce City, Missouri, that's in Lawrence County. Just to set this up so that you can get a sense of what happened, on Sunday, August 18th, 1901, a young woman, Gisela Wild, went to church in Pierce City along with her brother. And then after church was over, she left to walk back to their farm, which was along the railroad tracks. And her brother Carl had a couple of things he wanted to do in town. So she went alone, and about 15 minutes later, Carl follows. As Carl is walking down the railroad tracks, he comes to a small bridge, really over a dry creek bed. And he sees his sister with her throat cut, finger broken, lying in the creek bed. And I don't know, he didn't know if she was dead at the time, but she died within seconds of him coming upon her. There was, people came from all around. They started ringing the fire bell in town to see what was going on. And somebody mentioned, I think I saw a black near here, near the bridge, around the time that Gisela was passing. That was all it took. There is a standard scenario that virtually every newspaper played. It was sort of like the standard story. Like today we have the damsel in distress, down in the Caribbean or whatever, somebody who's missing. Back then it was the burly black brute assaulting the virginal young white girl. And it was the standard scenario. It's all it took. And then it was, the search was on to find the black. As word spread of the murder, people started to come in from all around the countryside, come into Pierce City to see what was going on. They were divided up into posses. They were sent in every direction to find any evidence. The only thing they found was Gisela's handkerchief. By Sunday night, they had gotten nowhere. At the same time, two ministers came into town, two black ministers. They were going to hold a revival meeting that night. Monday night. And they stayed with the Cobb family in Pierce City. Monday morning, or actually Monday afternoon, with no suspects whatsoever, they suspicioned two men in town. One was a teenager named Barrett, the other was an older black named Godley. They were arrested and put in the city jail. And so that's where we pick up with the story. While there are contradictory accounts of what occurred in the last few hours before the mob stormed the city jail, Every version mentions one pivotal moment. At around 8 p.m., a passenger train with 3 extra cars pulled into the station, and 300 men from Monette piled out. When they alighted from the train, a volley was fired, said one account, and they then demanded a Negro. Monette, which had lynched their own blacks 7 years earlier and driven every other black out of town, was here to help Pierce City. If there was any doubt about what would happen, the arrival of the Monette contingent dispelled it. The fire bell, used the day before to call people out to search for Gisella's killer, was now clanging wildly, telling the world that a mob had formed. At some time between 8 and 9 p.m., the mob stormed the jail on Walnut Street, just a few doors down from the church where Gisella had been the day before. No one stopped them. 6 or 8 men entered the jail with a sledgehammer, and with a few blows sprung the lock on a grated iron door. They grabbed Godley and Barrett and put ropes around their necks. As they marched the prisoners out of the jail, the mob fired a volley into the air. The gunfire continued as the mob leaders ran the 2 men down Walnut Street a few hundred yards toward the train depot until they reached the intersection with Commercial Street. The Hotel Lawrence, a boxy 3-story building, stood on the southwest corner of the intersection. An iron balcony that ran the length of the building jutted out over the sidewalk. Just a block south of the hotel were the train tracks, the depot, and beyond the depot, the Black Quarter. The mob stopped by the hotel, and the 2 prisoners were asked to tell what they knew about the murder. Neither man spoke. The mob marched the prisoners another block down Commercial Street, stopped again, and ordered them to confess. Barrett cracked. Hemmed in by the mob, a rope around his neck, the teenager said he knew who had killed Gisella Wilde. What exactly he said is in dispute. One account said he named Joe Lark. Another version had Barrett blaming Will Favors, a porter on the Frisco line who supposedly was staying with Joe Lark. Some people thought Barrett said Stark instead of Lark, and in the next few days police would look for a railroad porter named Stark. The one name he did not mention was Will Godley, a fact no one bothered to consider. Barrett was hustled away, but Godley's continued silence enraged the mob. He was forced over to a telephone pole, and they tried to hang him there. When they found the rope was too short, they marched Godley back to the Hotel Lawrence. As they stood under the glare of an electric streetlight, men in the crowd shouted, "String him up!" Someone snatched the rope tied around Godley's neck and climbed one of the posts that held up the hotel balcony. As several men grabbed Godley and boosted him up, the man on the balcony tied off his end of the rope to the balcony railing. Then they let go of Godley's body. As he started to strangle, the mob cheered. While Godley hung there, someone shouted, "Everybody, towards the depot! Get out of the way!" The men on Commercial Street took aim, and then there was the cry, "Now shoot, boys!" To one eyewitness, it looked like the wind was picking at Godley's clothing as the bullets ripped through him. Under the impact of each volley, the body began to sway back and forth. When the firing stopped, a drunken man walked up and began hitting the corpse and cursing it. The body hung at the hotel entrance for a half hour until a businessman in shirt sleeves shouted to the mob, "Boys, the ladies in the hotel want the body cut down. What do you say?" To cries of, "Down, down, down!" the rope was cut and Godley's body sprawled face up in the street. What had been the focus of their hatred now became the object of their curiosity. Someone tore away his shirt to see where the bullets had hit. A dozen or so women were escorted through the crowd to look at the corpse. A police judge tried to hold an inquest, but was hooted down. Eventually, the body was carried back to the jail and dumped there. Not everyone was interested in Will Godley's corpse. From the corner where the Hotel Lawrence stood, you could look down Walnut Street to the Black Quarter. It was a tempting target. Some in the mob now crossed the tracks and headed for the home of Pete Hampton, a leader in the black community. On the gentle rise above the downtown, where whites lived, people stood on the sidewalk watching what was happening below. The whites had the luxury of seeing that night as a spectacle. "We could see all from our house," one woman wrote later to a friend. "We sat out on the walks all night and until 3 o'clock in the morning, watching the breaking into the jail, the hanging, and the burning of the buildings. I couldn't keep from laughing at times at the strange things people did. But all in all, 'twas a serious matter." For blacks, crouching by their windows and staring helplessly, the night was somehow to be endured. Hiding in your home had provided the illusion of sanctuary, until now. But with whites advancing across the railroad tracks, that last illusion was gone. To resist was suicidal. But as they came to get him, Pete Hampton stepped to a window and fired. An attacker went down. He fired again, and another man went down. The mob fell back to Commercial Street. The rioters were furious. Men poured out of Commercial Street, formed a rough skirmish line along the railroad tracks, and began riddling the Negro Quarter about 50 yards away with gunfire. Inside the small two-story Cobb home, there was pandemonium. As bullets ripped through the wood-framed house, it was obvious the only safe place was the basement. But as the windows shattered and walls sprouted bullet holes, it was equally certain there was no way to get there through this firestorm. Some people hid under the beds. Maria Moss, a Cobb relative, used a trunk to shield herself. The two ministers lay on the floor, terrified. Within minutes, the gunfire died away. The mob had used up all its ammunition. Uncertain of what to do next, the rioters fell back to Commercial Street. As the mob milled about, a few men trotted up Walnut Street to the State Armory, next door to the city jail, and seized the rifles and ammunition, by one estimate 1,000 rounds, that had been loaned to the posses the day before. Unlike the shotguns, pistols, and assorted family weapons, these Army rifles represented a new level of violence. At the time, the Missouri National Guard was using model 1888 trapdoor rifles, which were able to penetrate a 3.5-inch piece of seasoned oak at 25 feet. Their steel-jacketed bullets could easily pass through the wood-frame homes in the Black Quarter. While the mob rearmed, the people in the Cobb house used the lull to crawl to the basement. As she wiggled to the basement stairs, Maria Moss noticed 3 bullet holes in her trunk. Outside, the mob streamed back to the railroad tracks and resumed the barrage. But not content to just pot away, members of the mob ran up to the homes lining the railroad tracks and began setting them on fire. By the end of the night, they would raze 5 homes. 15 people hid in the Cobb basement, the 2 ministers and 13 members of the Cobb and Moss families who shared the house. As they sat in the dark, bullets slamming into the house, the unmistakable odor of burning buildings drifted across the Negro Quarter. Amazingly, none had been injured in the first barrage. If their house was set on fire, however, they would all die horribly. The only escape was to the south. They would have to run through the Negro Quarter, wade a stream called Clear Creek, and then race up a small hill and into the tree line. Once in the woods, they would be safe. It was a distance of 400 yards over open, fairly level ground. Every step of the way would be lit by the burning buildings. They crawled up the stairs, and one by one they burst out of the house and ran madly towards the creek. Behind them, bullets cracked, and they could hear the zip of bullets. Pinky Cobb, the teenage daughter of James Cobb, made it as far as a well. 3 bullets whistled past. She panicked, grabbed the well rope, and swung herself down. As Reverend Pitcher ran through the yard, a bullet hit a soapbox lying on the ground next to him. Some people stumbled into the creek and lay there, too frightened to go further. Pinky, hiding inside the well, faced a new dilemma. If she let go of the well rope, she would drown. If she clambered out of the well, she might be shot. She chose gunfire. When I got to the creek, they were still shooting at me in the light of the burning buildings, she said. I jumped into the creek and bent down low to miss the bullets. Finally, I got across and escaped up the hill. By about 3 a.m., the mob had spent its fury. Some blacks who were hiding in the woods rested, while others, like the 2 ministers, decided to get as far away from Pierce City as they could. Pitcher and Smith began walking home to Carthage. In the white section of town, people slept in their clothes, afraid they might be called out again. Most of the rioters drifted away, but a few remained to patrol. Out of the darkness, one of them called, "Speak quick! Are you friend or foe? And be damn quick about it!" Pierce City fell into a long, uneasy sleep. After that barrage, within 24 hours, there was not a black left in Pierce City. In the days that followed, other towns descended on their black residents. and Lawrence County was cleansed. The ministers made it all the way back to Carthage. They had a couple of close calls, but they survived. Pinky, too, survived, and initially moved to Springfield. And a couple of her family now live in St. Louis. Today, there's exactly one black living in Pierce City. He's a town councilman. And in 2003, a tornado ripped away the downtown. And here's the nub of the thing. There was a whole series of tornadoes that ripped through the Midwest that day. And Pierce City was probably hit the hardest, but there was a number of people killed. And the next day, the New York Times, on their front page, had a picture of Pierce City in ruins and a story about what had happened. And if you look up that paper for that day, you read that whole story, and not once does it say there was a racial cleansing in Pierce City. It disappeared. And that's my story. So, happy to take questions.
What were you in Arkansas for in the first place?
I was working on a story on food safety. I could tell you things about food safety that would curl your hair.
So you were probably at Tyson's headquarters?
Yeah, Tyson's. My favorite, though, was Gold Kissed. They took, it's a terrible thing maybe to say before dinner, but they took diseased chickens and turned them into chicken nuggets that were then sold to school lunch programs. And I have many wonderful moments as a reporter, and this was one of them. I was talking to the federal food safety inspector, and so I said, what's the problem with these chickens? And he said, well, they got your air sacculitis, and it causes an exudate to form up here in the shoulder region. And I said, what's an exudate? That'd be your pus. So, yeah.
Because you're just a curious sort, and you were just kind of, once you got on this topic, and you were just kind of plugging things into the computer to see what it spit out, did you try to look to see if obviously there was a migration of blacks out of those cities to other locations they relocated? Did you look to see if any counties had changed in the reverse dramatically?
No. There was a unique characteristic or signature to those counties that went through a racial cleansing. They were typically rural, and they were typically had a relatively small black population. Forsyth County was the largest with 1,000. And when you think about it, it sort of makes sense. First off, it's a lot easier to intimidate a small group of people than it is a large group of people. But more importantly, if they were not economically important, then you could get rid of them. But for example, in I think it was Lowndes County, Georgia. I'm not. I could look it up, but they had a similar. They had a situation where a black farmhand killed a white farmer, and the whites went on a rampage and started slaughtering blacks. And some of it is really just gruesome what they did. Well, not surprisingly, blacks started to say, Brooks and Lowndes, two counties, Brooks and Lowndes County. Not surprisingly, blacks said, hey, I'm out of here. But in those counties, blacks were important as farm laborers. And so there you had a kind of racial cleansing in reverse. Blacks were told if they were caught leaving, they would be shot. So that was the importance of economics. So then when these people leave, you wouldn't see this enormous increase in some other county because there just weren't that many. And also, they would scatter. It wouldn't be like they would get up and go to just the next county.
So the communities didn't move in mass and stay together.
No. They just literally fled for their lives. And then what would happen is, using Pierce City as an example, they would go they ran from Pierce City. The newspapers in the area then ran stories about how the degraded blacks from Pierce City were coming to Carthage and Joplin and Springfield, and what should we do about that, because these are these are dangerous. And so I followed one group of blacks who went to Oklahoma, and a week later there was another racial cleansing. They drove all the blacks out of town in Oklahoma, and so they were pushed and forced, and they had like the mark of Cain on them. Yeah.
Two questions. One, the story that you just read for us, I assume there are other stories like in the book, or is
Oh, yeah.
there more?
Oh, there are quite a few more.
Okay, and the second, I'm curious about the title of the book.
Oh, Zora Neale Hurston. It's a quote from her in the beginning of the book. It has her quote. I can't claim credit for the title. My editor at Basic Books said, and I didn't know this, they test market these titles. I was going to call it American Apartheid, but apparently that didn't test well. So, yeah.
How do you define racial cleansing?
That's a real good question. It is actually a definition that was developed by the United Nations. And it was a bone of contention between myself and Cox Newspapers. Is that okay? When I went back to researching this, and the thing that I have to impress on you is, at the time that I was doing this, I had no idea what I was looking at. At every step along the way, it was like, what am I looking at here? And one of the really fascinating things that I came across was a book by Ray Stannard Baker. He was a journalist. He wrote a book called Following the Color Line in 1908. And he went through the South and then the North and wrote this book on race relations in the United States at that time. A terrific book. And in the book, he's talking about how blacks were driven out of places. And what was obvious to me as I'm reading this is that he didn't have the language to describe what was in front of him. And I think part of the reason is that it's a cliche, but it's cliche because it's true. History is written by the victors. And the victors really don't give a damn about what happens to the people that they've conquered. And so they don't talk about what took place after the battle. And as I went back through, I love classical history, one of I consider him sort of a homicidal maniac, was Julius Caesar. And he would go through Gaul, and he would just decimate the earth, cleanse it. And in fact, he was so brutal that it became a topic of conversation in the Senate. And Romans were not what you'd call warm, cuddly people. We only get the term in the 1990s during the war in the Balkans. And what happens there, and this has to do, I think, as much with technology as anything else, for the first time, the vanquished have the opportunity to speak and to tell their version of history. And so it's traced back, the term, actually ethnic cleansing, is traced back to a press conference where the Croats were talking about what was happening to them as the Serbs attacked. And they said, what's taking place here is ethnic cleansing. All of the Croats are being driven out of this area. And that's how the term begins. And in a way, it's an unfortunate term because the word cleansing implies you are somehow purifying something, which obviously isn't the case. it has a sort of a sardonic ring, though, to it, because it was the victims who gave it this term. Eventually, the UN develops their own definition, and basically what they're saying is it's when one group of people drives another group of people out of some sort of defined area. Now, I have the UN definition is actually in the book. It's right in the introduction. Because we have the term now, we can begin to describe, we can begin to talk about what actually took place. And I invite you, for example, I hope I'm not taking too much time on this, but words, I live for words. It's my business. And I would invite you to go to the NAACP website and read about their version of how the NAACP was formed. They talk about it as a riot that occurred in Springfield, Illinois, back in, I think it was 1909 or 1910, I don't remember exactly when. It wasn't a riot. It was a racial cleansing. There were signs put up saying, blacks must leave. But at the time that the NAACP was formed, and even till today, they didn't have the words to explain what was in front of them. Now, when I wrote the series on racial cleansing for Cox newspapers, I used the term racial cleansing. And it was fascinating to me. I interviewed somebody in Forsyth County, a white, who was part of the biracial commission there, and I said, you know, I just said, you know, I'm interested in the racial cleansing here in Forsyth County. He was furious with me, absolutely furious. It was not a racial cleansing. And he was furious because I believe, A, I was right, and B, he could no longer deny what took place because we finally had words to talk about what took place. When I wrote the series, I used racial cleansing throughout. The issue of using that phrase went all the way up to the president of Cox newspapers, who decreed, we shall not use the term racial cleansing. And the reason he gave was because it implies that it was genocide, and this wasn't genocide. Well, sorry, no. It doesn't imply it's genocide. I can show you the definition of ethnic cleansing. It has nothing to do with genocide. So why? It's because we deny what took place. We don't want to face our own history. And we will do almost anything to cloak it in euphemisms. And there is, I'm sorry if I'm taking so long here, but your question goes almost to the heart of everything I've written about. Yeah.
The definition, not just racial cleansing, but any cleansing,
Yeah.
implies an intent on the part of the cleansers.
Right.
Okay. And as I was listening to the story, I was wondering whether you felt that it was their intent to chase those people away, or whether they were just rioting, you know, the way people riot without, you know, saying, well, we really want to get rid of them.
No, the next day.
I mean, I know they left because they were scared.
Yeah, but the next day, the order was out. You will not live here.
Okay, that's what I was
Yeah.
wondering.
And sometimes it was actually a formally written thing, like in Comanche County, Texas. The mob went from home to home in Comanche and said, you have 10 days to leave. In Marshall County, Kentucky, they took about a dozen blacks down to the river, tortured them for about an hour, and then the leader of the Night Riders gave a speech and said, you must, you know, we're going to be back in 30 days. If you're still here, you're going to get worse.
Generally, where did these people go? Were they accepted in other places? Or?
Not really. Again, as I said before, with Pierce City, they then were marked because They were the blacks that had been driven out of Pierce City or Marshall County or whatever. And so I traced some from Birmingham, Kentucky, that's Marshall County. They went up to Paducah, some went other places. Yeah.
Whites in these counties, were they members of the Klan? Were these Klan-infested counties, or were they just your run-of-the-mill, ordinary, white, Southern or whatever American population? And the second question is, were you able to trace the time when the black population started to go back into those counties, and was there a specific trigger to that, or was it just a general migration?
Okay. As far as the Klan, I only found one cleansing that was directly related to the Klan, and that was in Indiana. In these other counties, the Klan really played little or no role, at least that I could find. There was a general air of racism, and it didn't need an organization. It existed in the air. Your second question was, triggered to move back. Well, here's the point. With very few exceptions, blacks did not move back. And one of the things that was surprising to me was that how we view geography. I'm white, I'm from New York, I read the New Yorker. I know that, sort of humorous cover which has a picture of New York City, and then there's sort of the middle of America, and then there's California, and that's sort of my view of the world, okay? But whites view the United States as sort of one contiguous mass. What I came away with from this project was blacks view it as a checkerboard, and there are certain squares you do not land on. And one of the things that I found was one of the rites of passage in a black family is when the son or daughter is old enough to drive, they're given the speech. And the speech contains two things, typically. One is, here's what you do when you're stopped by the cops. And the other is, these are the places you do not go. So there were no people moving back there. I do have a couple of stories, for example, Comanche County, Texas, where a black family moved back in the 1990s. 1980s. And I talk about what it was like for them to try to live in a county that had been racially cleansed. Trust me, it wasn't pretty. And these counties today actively discourage blacks from living there. So, for example, using Comanche County, Texas, you are a black, you drive through Comanche County, you'll suddenly find that there's a cop on your tail, and he's just following you. And he's just making sure that you go through Comanche and out the other side. And if you don't, I think you're in trouble.
I have a question. At some point in your talk, you linked tornadoes with a sort of a missed opportunity to say something about this racial cleansing.
Yeah, well,
I don't quite understand how that would have been, but people would have felt that that was an appropriate time to talk about it either.
if each of, communities in the United States, for example, if a tornado ripped through Shiloh, the news story, I'm sure the next day would say the site of a Civil War battlefield, blah, 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 blah. Or I'm trying to think of some other, sort of famous sites.
Columbine, Colorado.
Yeah.
Which comes back with the shootings in the schools
Yeah.
all the time.
It's just tagged to it.
I see too.
But, but a racial cleansing, no. That is not part of the history. In fact, in the 1970s, because this whole subject is enveloped in euphemisms and lies and half-truths, in the 1970s, they wrote a centennial, history of Pierce City. And I was fascinated. How are they going to handle this? How are they going to talk about what took place? And the woman who wrote the history said that the blacks all left after, and this is an exact quote, after a disturbing situation. That's it. That's what happened. Yeah, good.
You knew the consequences that would take place. What gave you the courage and the drive to pursue this subject?
Well, good question. It really goes to the heart of why I became a reporter. You know, I've covered countless sewage disposal meetings and sat through acres of county waste disposal meetings and on and on and on. But why you're really there is to give a voice to people who don't have a voice, and to tell their story. And as I investigated this, I realized that I was, and this is maybe me puffing myself up, but it is the truth. I was the last best hope for these people who are absolutely innocent, whose passing would never be known unless somebody wrote about it and wrote about what happened to them. And there came a point where I said, we have to tell the truth about this. This is absolutely critical. This is far more important than anything I've ever done. And so at that point, and as my two ex-wives will tell you, I am very bullheaded. So I wasn't going to be stopped.
I like your answer.
Yeah.
You talked about how your editors took the racial cleansing as a big no way. Did you get any feedback from the black community about the terminology you used?
No. It was, no, none. Hadn't even thought about it till you mentioned it, but it was,
I wonder if you think they'll embrace they. I mean, at least some of them, and they is a big definition.
I'm sorry?
I'm saying they. I don't know exactly who they. But
What do you anticipate now? Because now that your book's out, you're probably going to get more feedback.
Yeah, well, I've definitely gotten
It's gonna
feedback.
reach a broader audience.
Well, what I've gotten back from the black community is, well, Jesus, it's about time.
but nothing about the term racial cleansing.
No, I mean, it's like, yeah, well, absolutely. I'm trying to think here. You're absolutely right. I have not had a single black say, what do you mean racial cleansing? That wasn't a racial cleansing. We just left. Yeah, no, didn't happen.
Or some might just, be deterred to use it because it might be too overwhelming.
No, absolutely not.
To rock the boat.
Yeah.
Now, you said earlier on that there were over 200 counties that you found
Mm-hmm. Well,
that had dramatic migrations.
right.
But fitting your criteria, were there more than the ones you write about that fit your criteria?
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely.
How many eventually?
I have no idea. It took me I'm going to say 3 solid years of work to develop the history of these 12 counties. And it's I can't begin to tell you how difficult it is, because there's almost nothing there. And a lot of times it relies strictly on luck. Like Marshall County, Kentucky, I'm trying to figure out what happened there. I go to an old courthouse record, and in the records, somebody had misfiled, or I shouldn't say misfiled, the interview notes with the blacks who had been driven out, as well as the night riders. And I had the police notes, the accounts. I had these people speaking after 100 years as to what took place there. exciting moment. But most of the time, it was just piecing together one little fact and one. So I know there are many more, but how many more? I don't know.
Of those, if you look at, and you said the spread of those counties were across the U.S. to some degree.
Yeah.
More prevalence in the southeast?
More prevalent, yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Would you put a percentage of that 200? I mean, just roughly.
I'd say 80%.
And any one state that really stood out more than another?
The two that stick out in my mind are Tennessee and Kentucky. It was interesting too. There's a Filson Historical Society. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but they're this private historical society that is really a powerhouse. I mean, they're just major, and they're based in Kentucky. And I remember at the beginning of this project calling them up and saying, were there any racial cleansings in, I didn't say racial cleansing at that time, but I explained the process. And they went, no, not in Kentucky. You had a question?
Yeah, you said in response to the question from the lady in front of you that you felt this was a book that just had to be written. And I wanted to ask you, firstly, why, and then secondly, what do you hope or anticipate will be the reaction or the response to the book?
Why it had to be written? Let me turn it around and answer your last question first, and it'll give you the answer to the first question. You come away from this with the realization that there are two histories in the United States, a white history and a black history. And we saw this in sharp relief after Hurricane Katrina. And I remember this vividly because I was in the newsroom. And, blacks were streaming out of New Orleans, and we were writing stories saying, black refugees jamming bus stations in, Louisiana, that sort of thing. And almost immediately, black leaders were furious and screaming at newspapers, how dare you call us refugees? We are citizens of this country. And, we kind of took a step back and said, what's the problem here? Well, from the white perspective, remember, this never happened. From the black perspective, this is central to the black experience in the United States, that, they're not allowed to vote, and they were driven from pillar to post. They were not considered citizens. And how dare you even imply that we're not citizens? That's the misunderstanding. And that's what I hope this book will eventually achieve, is a discussion, or at least begin the discussion on what are these two histories, and maybe we come to an American history, which is the confluence of both white and black experience. That's why it's so important.
As an FYI, the only county that you mentioned that I knew of before was Forsyth.
Yeah.
And the reason is not because my mother's from Atlanta, but about 5 or 6 years ago, Oprah Winfrey took her whole show down there because of I can't remember the details, but some in the high school, one of the high schools, or you may know the specifics.
Yeah.
But she was down there. She did 2 days worth of shows, from 2 or 3, and it was just a very small amount of black people. And isn't Forsyth the home of Stone Mountain? You know where Stone Mountain is?
No, but it's near there. Absolutely near there. That plays a pivotal role in this book, because when I wrote the story, it actually occurred in 1987. And what happened was there was a Brotherhood March into Forsyth County, and it was met by about 400 Klansmen and Nazis and assorted racists, and driven back. And so the next week there was 20,000 people marched into the county. And so I write about that, and I write about the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and how they covered it. And the last time that they wrote about what took place in Forsyth County, they called the racial cleansing there a legend. And so when I wrote this body of stories, the editors at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution went bananas. And to this day, they have refused to run a word of what I've written. And a little interesting side note, a few days ago, Hank Klibanoff, one of the editors at the AJC, won a Pulitzer for a book that he wrote with Gene Roberts on the race beat. And it was about how we started to cover race during the civil rights period. So he won a Pulitzer for that. Obviously advocating that, you should, cover these issues. The guy who was instrumental in making sure that my stories didn't run in Atlanta was Hank Klibanoff.
Because Cynthia Tucker got a Pulitzer also,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, right.
She knows you probably?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You ought to read her editorials on this.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. I don't need to read much.
It won't take you long. Trust me. Yeah.
Toni Morrison wrote very well about the horrible things that happened to black people in this country. Did you have any contact with her? I mean,
No.
she wrote a book about a town that was populated solely by black people somewhere in Oklahoma or Arkansas or something. I don't know how they got there. This is fiction. And then she wrote Beloved, which of course is gut-wrenching. And she did another novel called Jazz about black people who migrate to New York looking for work, out of need. I think that was in the 20s or something. So if people want to read fiction, I could suggest reading some of the things that she wrote.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
One last question from me.
Okay.
Just reflecting upon then your profession really and your role in it then before you wrote this book, or maybe not your role in it, but just how the media works, because now you have this amazing insight into the miseducation, non-education, I don't know what you want to call it, of the American people, which has been perpetuated by the media, your profession. So, and you were part of that, so you were doing it as well, I suppose, before your eyes were opened. So how does that make you feel about the media now, your profession, and is there any way in which you think you could change that?
Yeah, fat chance. It's a mixed bag. When I was looking at these different racial cleansings, there were newspapers that stood up to the mob, denounced the mob, and did the right thing. Corbin, Kentucky, Comanche County, Texas, and I talk about that. In general, the newspapers follow, don't lead the public. And so we have a standard set of stories that we use, and they're a formula, and then we just jam the facts into that formula. So one formula was burly black brute rapes young virginal white girl. And no matter what took place, we trot out the formula. And I use an example in Unicoi County to show you exactly how that works. And you see this today, Fox News, the damsel in distress story, and it's always a pretty blonde white girl, and she disappears or what have you, and it plays for days on end. One of the things that I came away from this with is an appreciation. Again, I keep coming back to this. It was a real learning experience for me. An appreciation for how we need to rethink how we cover things. And so about a third of the way into the book, I realized that basically what I was doing was I was writing a white history of these events. I had no black voices. And I sort of sat back and thought, I can't do it this way. If I do, I'm going to miss this history. And so I consciously went out and looked for the black voices, the black testimony, to get that into this book. It is the most difficult thing you can do, absolutely, because there's almost nothing there. And every once in a while, I would get incredibly lucky. When I was in Atlanta, I stumbled across a stack of tapes, oral histories that had been taken back in the 1980s. And one was Kathleen Anderson, and she was actually in Forsyth County during the racial cleansing. She was a child, and she saw things as a child sees things. But it was a gripping story from her standpoint of her grandmother who had been a slave, you know, being driven out and what that meant to that family. And when I did that, when I started to get that perspective, a lot of things, a lot of possibilities opened up to me that hadn't been there before. That's something, you know, it's in newspaper business we call that diversity training, which is a horrible, horrible term. But it's something that we as the press have to become skilled at. Yeah.
So did you look at some of the accounts that the black newspapers ran?
Yeah, yeah. They were pretty awful. I mean, a lot of what you saw in the black newspapers was not entertainment, but society events. And
I mean, about the events that happened, were
they
I know some of their offices would be bombed, or they would be run out of town as well, they wrote.
Well, in the towns where that I was writing about, there was no black press, period. Where you saw the black press was in major cities, you know, like Chicago, for example. But they would not, you know, they would not typically cover these events. It was typically, you know, local events, society events, and that wasn't, you know, that was also the white newspapers as well. So, for example, I would go to small country newspapers, white newspapers, in the counties where the cleansing had taken place, and they wouldn't write a word. You know, but they would talk about the crops, and, you know, Elmer met, you know, with Fudd, and, you know, and yeah. It's pretty awful stuff. Yes?
You mentioned some relative who was living, a relative of somebody who had been chased out of town. Did you find any other living descendants, anybody who could?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Any number of them?
Yeah,
One or two?
yeah. And in fact, I start one of the chapters, the Forsyth County chapter, with Lily Nash, and her great-grandfather, Joe Pa Naylor, was driven out of Forsyth County. And she remembers as a child sitting in the kitchen listening to the stories of what it was like to live in Forsyth County before the racial cleansing and what happened afterwards. Then there were the Brown brothers, who their family was the Cobbs and the Mosses, and, you know, and I tell their story and their discovery.
Were they welcoming of your inquiry?
Oh, very.
How did they respond?
Very, very, very. I mean, they were terrific. Yeah. Most people, white and black, you know, were you know, very kind, very generous. I mean, obviously, I had some people who said, "I don't want to talk about it," and, you know, hung up the phone or left or walked away. I remember one interview in Tennessee. And there's this old guy, and we sit down in the Burger King, and I start to ask him a few questions, and he looks at me and says, "You're not a Jew, are you?" Oh, I just knew that day was going to be a long one. Hey, you said. Okay.
How established were these communities in the counties? Did you get any sense of the length of time they had been?
Oh, they went back to slavery. Oh, they were. Comanche County, there were accounts of they came as slaves, and in fact, the newspaper wrote a story at the time they were driven out and said, "How dare you drive out these people because they helped build this county right along with the whites." So no, they long time. Okay, I think I've exhausted your patience. Thank you.
And